Welcome again to the second day for the Business for the Environment Summit. As we heard from Mr. Gore, Vice President Gore, yesterday, we know just how important the role of business will be in determining the success or failure of the coming negotiations at Cancun, and really beyond that to the success or failure of our societies as we grapple with what he calls the climate crisis. Instead of just responding to the dictates of the political arena, we need business, as we've heard again and again here, to be an active player, shaping the global response to global warming, both in terms of what business can do and what they want done. The breakout sessions that you were all good enough to attend yesterday afternoon were designed to help shape the message for policymakers at Cancun on a sector-by-sector basis. Kind of not being a journalist, not being a member of any business, or at least not successful one right now, I skipped between a few of them. I could see that there was a genuine effort being made by the participants at each meeting to define what their sector can deliver for Cancun and what they want to see diplomats achieve at that meeting, and as well what each sector is willing to commit to now and for the future as well. I know those discussions weren't always all that easy. I was with your coordinators here last night as we hammered out the specific language, but assembled together, you've really managed, I think, to lay the foundations for a strong, proactive message to the diplomats at Cancun this December. The result is the B4E statement that you should have with you right now. I won't go into great detail into it because we'll have a lot of time over the next few hours to discuss it. But just I wanted to point out to a couple of key passages that caught my eye as I was going through it, and also fits with something the Undersecretary was talking about as well. There's that line that thoughtful action on climate change can play a critical role in stimulating the global economy. I think that's particularly important. The global financial crisis is still being felt around the world. I know in the United States, where we have midterm elections coming up this November, the issue with unemployment, with economic sluggishness really is going to be the defining issue there at that election. And the first question any policymaker will have when it comes to action on carbon is what will its impact be on the economy? What will its impact be on jobs? As well, as a speaker I think pointed out yesterday, fear of climate change by the developed world can't be allowed and won't be allowed, frankly, to trump the legitimate aspirations for hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of millions of poor people around the world. The job of business is going to have to be to find a way to achieve both objectives. The statement also sets clear goals and targets for future carbon concentrations and a call to limit temperature increase to that all-important 2 degrees Celsius figure that we all know. And also, importantly, it calls for governments to act to set some limits in the short term as well. I think we all know mid-century targets are great and they're fairly easy to set, but they're well beyond the business plans and as well probably the lifespans of most of the people who will be discussing the issue at Cancun. Right now we're going to have each sector representative give a short presentation outlining their specific asks and commitments for Cancun. But before I go into that, we'll also then have some questions here at the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But I also want to just leave you with 2 quick stories that I think from the past few days that demonstrate the importance of the work that you're doing. Just yesterday, Bob Litterman, who is the former head of Goldman Sachs Risk Analysis Department and a member as well as Jim Leap's board for the World Wildlife Federation, gave a talk where he said that unpriced carbon had led markets to drastically underestimate the risks of climate change. He said that if the world couldn't come around to dealing with the climate crisis, if it couldn't come to putting a price on carbon or doing something along those lines, he really believes we face a chance of heading into another financial crisis every bit as devastating as the subprime mortgage meltdown was. And then one other bit of news, according to the Clean Tech Group, a venture capital watchdog group in the US, global venture capital investment in clean technology fell by 30% in this most recent third quarter of 2010. That's a $1.5 billion drop in money that could have gone to solutions that are supposed to combat climate change. I think it's potentially a worrying trend if it continues, and I believe it's also connected to the uncertain messages that policymakers are sending to business on climate change, again, especially in the US and in California where a lot of that money was being spent. So I think now is the time for business to send a very strong message back to those policymakers. So I'll introduce the panelists here one at a time and allow them to give a short presentation about their sector. I'm going to start with Bryan Jacob, who is in the middle there. He was the coordinator for the food, beverage, and agricultural sector. He's director for energy management and climate protection at Coca-Cola, and he manages a number of the company's environmental initiatives. Bryan.
All right, thank you. Well, I'll start from the outset to say that I usually represent the Coca-Cola company, and I'm not even usually a spokesperson for the beverage industry, much less the food, beverage, and agriculture sector, or I might contend that it's really a super sector. And I think that was the nature of our difficulty yesterday, the real challenge for us, to adequately represent that the full spectrum from multinational conglomerates down to individual families that have gardens and supply some of their own food, or somebody who may have a few chickens and raise eggs to satisfy their village. And when you talk about food, beverage, and agriculture, that's where it fits. So it's a wide spectrum. That said, we did have a really good session. We had right around 50 people participating, a little more than 40 in the audience, plus our 7 panelists. And we came up with what I think is a set of reasonable statements and assertions that complemented the call to action. Before I go into those details, I'll offer just a few framing comments that didn't make their way into the statement. I couldn't find a way to massage them in there, but I think they are relevant for context. One of those that came up in our session was that by certain accounting, 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to the agriculture sector, and another 16% on top of that can be related to the agriculture sector and their impacts on deforestation. So just to put it in perspective, we're working on a possibility of around 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And a separate comment that was raised in the session quantified or estimated what the magnitude of the opportunity is, and pegged it between 5 and 15 gigatons. So just to put order of magnitude on it. One other comment that I'll offer before we look at the text, and it's to look at it from a different lens, that being food security. So someone raised a quote that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had provided earlier in the year that said, "There can be no food security without climate security." So he clearly established that interrelationship, and they are integrated and probably need to be addressed as such. Now, all that said, I presume everybody does have the statement in front of them. Ours is rather long, the contribution from the food and beverage and agriculture sector. We did limit the first call, the 2 bullets at the top, to 2 specific issues regarding what we believe Cancun can deliver to facilitate our sector's engagement. One of those is acknowledgement of the agri-food and beverage system as a strategic sector, and going on to further define and promote what sustainable agricultural practices are, so we have some consistency in that definition. The second big thing that we would rely on Cancun to deliver is promoting small-scale farmers. And again, this is how we tried to accommodate the interests that were not present in the room, but we feel like we have an obligation to those folks. And you can see the language there that focuses heavily on investment capability, possibly relying on an adaptation fund for agriculture, specifically directed to agriculture, reflecting our perception that it's capital constraints that are holding back some of the smaller farmers, not a lack of familiarity with what technologies are available to them. As we move into the policy instruments that we would expect at the national level, it's more of a laundry list of things that we thought was relevant, and some of them are broader and more general, not unique to the agriculture sector, but promoting transparency and a life cycle approach, also promoting full disclosure and certification programs. We use the example of sustainable timber as a certification program that could be modeled and applied to other agriculture commodities. We also, you heard, I think, yesterday some commentary about biofuels and the unintended consequences of those, particularly the first generation biofuels using feedstock commodities as, food commodities as feedstocks, high water uses and what have you. So we've got that in there in terms of developing common approaches and guidance on appropriate use of biofuels. The next one, a common set of performance indicators, is again not unique to agriculture, but we think is relevant. Same with the next one about stop subsidizing energy and water and establish a price on carbon. You'll probably hear that from other sectors as well. Not unique to agriculture, but it does stem from a conversation that we had about the prospect of organic farming being cost competitive or being even less expensive than conventional farming practices within about 5 years. And it all really deals with the kinds of subsidies that are provided now, which are incentivizing perhaps the wrong practices. Low interest finance, that gets back to my earlier comment of our expectation from Cancun to provide the right financial mechanisms for some of the smallholder farms. Moving a little more quickly now, intensification of agriculture, which was a comment that I wasn't even familiar with at the time, but it reflects trying to meet the needs of the growing population without expanding deforestation, either converting forests to agriculture or to cattle pasture. And there was a comment that intensified agriculture on existing agricultural lands is 3 to 6 times more carbon efficient than expanding the land for agriculture. And lastly, in this space, we think there needs to be more investment on basic agri-science. The commentary being that it needs to be on par with the kinds of sums that are invested in energy research, primary energy research. Private companies can certainly do a lot of that and develop and implement the technological breakthroughs, but it's this upstream kind of pre-competitive investment that we think the national governments need to fund. Then as far as commitments from the sector, given the prelude that I made about it being such a vast and broad sector and not all the interests represented in the room, you're not going to see a quantitative commitment in here, but and I'll even read it because I'm pretty comfortable with the language here. It says, the food, beverage, and agriculture sector is committed to leading by example. Many firms in our sector have established quantitative commitments, and we encourage broader adoption of commitments consistent with the UNFCCC theme of common but differentiated responsibilities. And a lot of dialogue about one size does not fit all in the agriculture space, and we can't expect the same from a big company versus a smallholder farm, or one particular agricultural commodity versus another. So we'll invoke that language from the UNFCCC in this context, common but differentiated responsibilities. We also acknowledged here in the commitments from the sector that the multinational companies do have a sense of obligation to the smaller parties that are part of this sector. So we've got that in there. And ultimately at the end, we also have a role to play in improving farmer livelihoods and further to help meet the needs of the 800 million people hungry every day, and that's a conservative estimate, while also fulfilling the expectations of our share owners, because it does have to be done profitably. Many of us are in for-profit businesses.
Thanks very much, Bryan. My apology, I think they haven't quite gotten all those copies out yet, but you'll be getting them very soon of the B4E statement. Now, to Bryan's left is Angelina Galiteva, who is the coordinator for the energy and utilities sector. She is the chairperson of the World Council for Renewable Energy. She's also principal of New Energies Option Inc. and ATG Energy. Angelina.